bientôt. First of all, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Sam Watts. I am the CEO of Welcome Hall Mission, or Mission Bon Accueil à Montréal, a facility that's been in that city since 1892. No, I am not the founder. And you caught that, didn't you? Même en anglais, ça fonctionne, ça, hein? I also wear two other hats while I'm here at this conference. I am a member of the board of directors of the Alliance, and I also have the privilege of sitting on the National Housing Council, appointed recently by Minister Hussein. And you heard the National Advocate talk about the establishment of the National Council that is a function of the National Housing Strategy. So it's a real privilege to be able to serve as your moderator today. And I don't have much work to do because we got three great presenters. And so they're going to present, and I first of all want to make sure that we acknowledge where we are, which is that we are meeting today on the land of the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and it's now the home to many diverse First Nations, as we know, including Inuit and Métis peoples. And we acknowledge that the city of Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we are grateful for the fact that they have stewarded the lands and the waters in this area and are allowing us to meet on them today. Our session today, as you know, is Je suis la seule personne qui est devant vous et entre la fin de la journée. So this is a very difficult spot to be in because I realize that this is the last presentation of the day, but our presenters are so fabulous that you're going to be so engaged you're not going to want to leave. Okay? That's a promise from me to you. I want to remind everybody that this session is in fact being recorded. So everything you say and do, no, it's not true. Actually, because of some of the technical things, we were hoping to be able to do questions from the audience, but if you have questions towards the end of the session, there'll be that opportunity, but you're actually going to have to come and stand here to ask your questions so that you can be seen by the people who are watching virtually. So kind of tricky because you can't just sort of hide where you are and ask your question anonymously. You're going to have to come to the front with your questions, but we'll manage through that. And I want to thank our presenters, Zoe, Sue-Ann, Caroline. I'm going to let them present themselves. I promised them I would do no flowery introductions because, hey, who needs a flowery introduction? They are extremely well-qualified people, and when you listen to what they have to say and the research they've conducted, I think you'll agree with me. So, are we good to go? Good. So, let me get out of the way, and you're going to stand there? Zoe? Okay, let me move all this stuff out of the way. You can stand in this place, and then the people at home will see you just fine.
Okay. Yeah, because I can't like sit there and look here. You're gonna injure me. My name is Zoe Dodd, and I am a community scholar at MAP Center for Urban Health Solutions, which is located at Unity Health at St. Michael's Hospital. I'm on a secondment there for my job at South Riverdale Community Health Center, where I've worked for 14 years, and I've been doing work in the downtown east of Toronto, mostly around harm reduction, overdose, drug policy work, homelessness work for about 20 years. So I'm really, so full disclosure, I was a person who worked in the encampments, supporting people as soon as COVID hit. Our organization closed its doors on the many people that use our services, and myself and my colleague Les Harper over here, we went right away into the parks, and because everybody went into the parks too, and we're visibly in the encampments. There are a number of people here who also have the experience of living in an encampment and also being here as people who are advocates and supporting people in encampments. So thanks for being here. This is going to be, I don't know if people were in the session next door with Ian. This is going to be really different and a different perspective. It's not a counter narrative as this is billed. It is a narrative from people who had the experience of living in the encampments and people who are doing support to people in the encampments during COVID-19. This is also not about resilience. This is about survival. And so this is the team of people that worked on this research. So if you go to the next slide. So I just also have my own land acknowledgement. I also just want to say that how we say it is Haudenosaunee. And also the Mississaugas of the Credit River have not signed Treaty 13, which is a mistake lots of us make. But just so you're aware, they never signed the treaty. And some of our members also live on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. And I just wanted to acknowledge, like, this is a trespass notice that's given to people who are in encampments. Indigenous people can't be trespassing on their own land. And so when we talk about we're not as settlers allowed to be here, we're part of colonization. And the way in which the city operates is in a colonial way. So when we're hearing someone from the other who's consulting say that they take an anti-colonial approach, they do not. They take a colonial approach. When you start with government and then leaders and business, and then you have people with experience way at the bottom, that is a colonial approach. So it's critical to acknowledge the disproportionate number of Indigenous peoples in encampments and respect their right to self-determination and self-governance. And I always think of what my friend Les Harper, who's here as an Indigenous knowledge keeper for the days, taught me. It's like also about non-interference. So encampment evictions are deeply harmful, displacing people from their community supports and perpetuating colonial violence. And more preventative efforts are needed so that people do not become homeless in the first place. So I'm a researcher on this project. I wear two hats. I came to be on this project because they needed a community partner who was familiar with the encampments. So our whole research team, we have doctors and researchers, people with lived experience. And so if you could go to the next slide. I just also want to dedicate this report to the many community members who died as a result of ongoing systemic oppression and the housing and overdose crisis. This man here, his name is Dom. You can look him up on the internet. This was actually at the encampment in Alexandra Park. People in the encampments were organizing for their own survival and their own rights. Dom participated in our study. Dom died after being cleared out of an encampment. I don't know if people watched the militarized operation of the city of Toronto, but when they went to Alexandra Park, he was one of the people that was moved out by that militarized operation. We talk about safety, and I'm going to talk about this in our research. That's not safety. And it's okay to be very blunt about what's existing here because we're at a place of urgency as we move into the winter. And I just want to remind us that people in encampments, which we don't have to say, but they're human beings. So we're in a crisis. Every day in September in the city of Toronto, 170 people were turned away from the shelter system. They could not find a bed. They phoned 311, they sat on the phone. This is the city's own data. And here we are in this building squashed in between two shelters. I don't know if people noticed them, but one over here that was supposed to be a temporary shelter that's like a dome and you have to share cots, like it's cots. You don't share the cot, but you share the space. And then the other one is called the Better Living Center, which they opened partway through the pandemic, which is just over here where they put people in what look like cages or jails and had like performative plexiglass, opened it during COVID. And it's hilarious. It's called the Better Living Center. The irony is not lost on the people who've been forced to stay there. So the city of Toronto is also closing Shelter Hotel. Did I get the number right or did I get it wrong? It's right, yeah. It's average. These are average shelter hotel spaces, and about half the people staying in these shelters are currently staying in the shelter hotel. Oh, the BLC closed, sorry. That also closed. So our system is way past full. It's operating at 99%. And so this is a humanitarian crisis, a catastrophe, and people who are homeless who have died over the pandemic could fill 3 shelters. So we talk about numbers, but just imagine that actually it would take that, not the occupancy of the place over there. That's probably 5 of those is how many people have died. Many of them who were living in encampments, and I'll talk about that research as I go. So for background, people have forced to live outside for decades in Toronto. It's nothing new. The cost of rent, the lack of housing options, the loss of income, the decrease of shelter beds, the conditions of the shelters, it costs like $2,500 and some odd dollars on average for a 1-bedroom apartment in the city of Toronto. Who can afford that? And so we're talking, and then, so this is something I've noticed at this conference, that's really why I've never come to this conference before, full disclosure, is that they don't ever talk about the financialization of housing, the commodification of housing, about capitalism. People are using words like decolonialism, decolonial, like what are you talking about? We live in a colonial state. So like that also comes with capitalism. That also comes with greed and the financialization of housing. Those are things that are all intertwined. The solutions actually start there, and that's not where we're talking about. We're always looking for band-aids to this issue. So the public health messaging to people said, be 6 feet apart. So that's what people did. They were outside being 6 feet apart. And shelter hotels were opened as a response to COVID-19. And to be very frank with you, they weren't open because the city was like, this is a great idea. Like people had to advocate for that. People had to take the city to court to make beds be 6 feet apart. Like these were decisions, people were not making decisions based on the health and welfare of homeless people. So for more background, so evicting encampment residents has been something in the city of Toronto that's gone on for decades. In 2019, prior to the pandemic, 700 encampments were dismantled, over 700. And however, public health guidelines during the pandemic and greater community visibility of encampments made it actually harder for the city to evict people. So people started showing up, like workers, we were all saying, you can't evict people. Like CDC guidelines are saying, we need people to stay in place. If you evict them, then we don't know where they went. If you keep them there, it's easier for us to deal with this pandemic. And we at that time did not know what the pandemic was, really. And so they wanted to evict people, but people started, like neighbors started coming out and asking workers, what can we do? And we'd never stopped encampments before, and people showed up under the bridge of the Gardiner to stop the city from evicting people because they wanted people to stop moving them out. And so people could stay put so that we could actually support people where they were at. So our objectives of our research were aimed to answer the following questions. What kind of outreach supports, including shelter or housing options, were actually offered to encampment residents? Did supports meet encampment residents' needs? And in what ways did supports affect encampment residents' lives, both positive and negative? And our full 83-page report can be found at www.maphealth.ca. And I would really encourage people to read it. It has an executive summary if you only want to read 10 pages. So we held a multi-stakeholder, community-based mixed methods evaluation. We conducted surveys, we did qualitative interviews, we used an intersectional lens and a transformative approach. This is the timeline of our study activities. We started in the summer of 2020 by getting people together, talking to encampment residents and workers, trying to suss out what our evaluation should look like. And so these were the problems that we highlighted. The first was the lack of affordable housing and resource allocation, the increasing encampments and acts of harm towards people living in them, and the basic needs of encampment residents not met by the city and risk of human rights violations. I mean, we're just talking about basic things like a washrooms in a park not getting opened for people when everything's closed down, they couldn't get inside to even use a toilet. We recruited at 6 encampments between March and June 2021. A community researcher with lived experience helped facilitate the recruitment. We interviewed 16 key informant outreach workers from 6 groups, including volunteers and paid staff. Between June 2021 and September 2021, we analyzed the surveys descriptively, we analyzed interviews using thematic analysis, and we spent a long time on data analysis. Okay. So these are some of our results. So as you can see, there's a mix of gender. 26% of the people that we surveyed were Indigenous, 16 Black, 11% other racialized identities. You know, Black people make up a big proportion of people on the streets of Toronto. When I do a lot of work in Moss Park, at one point, the majority of everyone staying in the park were Black. And people talked a lot about the kind of racism and the overlooking that they received being in the park from outreach workers. 30% were no longer staying in an encampment at the time we surveyed them, and many had stayed in more than one encampment. So the month prior to the pandemic, 17% of people were already living in an encampment and 29% were living elsewhere on the street. And 36% of the people we spoke to had been renting a place or staying with friends and family. And 50% of people moved to the encampment because for reasons related to the pandemic. Many residents described finding a trusted community or family in the encampments. They often support each other and work together on daily tasks, including watching each other's personal possessions, sharing food or other items, and helping people when they need assistance. So you're not by yourself in the encampment. In the shelter on the street, you're by yourself, but in the encampment, everyone has to look out for each other to make sure you're good. Right? That's how you keep a nice home. Everyone plays a part. And so these are the results of the outreach support. 69% of residents agree that the outreach support they received while staying in encampment met their basic needs. And the number one thing that they said was food and then tent. And so like just survival supplies. And then the supports most needed but not available was housing. A phone, some people said they got everything they needed, counseling, mental health, bathroom and shower, but housing was like the number one thing. Everyone talked about that. When we were interviewing people, we surveyed people, they would laugh. They would be like, housing, but as if anyone's gonna talk to us about housing. So then we talked to people about their experiences with housing and shelter. So the interactions with city workers were often related to getting shelter offers, which residents experienced as rushed or coercive by the threat of eviction. Among residents who'd been evicted from an encampment, 32% went on to stay in another encampment the week after. So people are going and then they're just cycling back, like this is not working. So 55% of residents were offered a shelter option by city staff, with 77% of those residents being offered shelter hotels. Only 4% of residents were offered permanent housing, and 75% of residents who accepted an offer or shelter housing from the city returned to live in an encampment again. I'm just gonna go through these because I really wanted to get to the findings. So, I mean, these are important too. These are also findings. So 29% of residents were kicked out of a shelter or housing offer they had accepted. I mean, that number is quite high. So people would go, the policies weren't clear to people. People talked a lot about the kind of conditions at the shelters, and just like really quick to be discharged, which we know is a big problem within our system, people being discharged a lot. And then people also being in a neighborhood, like this person says, did you accept that offer? I did, and it didn't last long because it was nothing like they explained. It felt like rather like I was almost being jailed. Like it's such a tight curfew. And then another person talks about being so far away from their supports. I mean, there were workers going out who were not the city workers offering shelters and showing people on their phones, like, if you take this offer, it's going to take you an hour and a half to get on the bus, and this is what's in that location. And that's far. That's really far. And so people were moving that far away. And then how do you get, have money to go there? Okay. Are you keeping track of my time? Because I'll talk forever. Okay, so many participants reported not being very worried about COVID-19. So actually people in the encampments were, had a lot of, they were wearing masks. They had hand sanitizer. They knew from public health guidelines that being outside was safer. That's what we were all being told is like, do not be in a congregate setting. Being outside 6 feet from someone is safer. And we didn't have COVID in the encampments for a long time. I also worked on the Anishinaabe COVID testing van, and we would test homeless people. We barely found COVID in the encampments because people were right. They were safer in the encampments. And so most people were taking precautions to try to prevent it, and outreach helped. It was like a lot of information sharing about COVID. And so also substance use experiences. We are also having the crisis of toxic drug deaths in our city and across the country. 29% had experienced an overdose that required naloxone in an encampment, and 79% had witnessed an overdose that required naloxone in an encampment. And however, residents said that overdose deaths were less likely in encampments versus shelter hotels for several reasons. So here's some things about the deaths. There was a much higher total number of overdose deaths in shelters and shelter hotels than in the encampments, but that's all because I would say the population of people in the shelters is also much higher. There were 74 overdose deaths in Toronto shelter system from the beginning of 2020 through June 2021, yet 9 deaths in known encampments. And, and you can actually thinking about those deaths, I can think about the stories of so many of these people because I knew a lot of people who died. And like, just like someone moving, they're being forced to move. 2 weeks later, they're dead in the shelter. Or I helped a man get on a bus. Next day, he was dead in the shelter. People just not having the supports that they needed for their survival, going to these places, and those places not being prepared to deal with this crisis, which is the biggest crisis. This is bigger than COVID for people. And it speaks to how dangerous the drugs were and how it complicates people's lives. And if they weren't deadly, people could be inside safely for overdose risk. But the toxic drugs do undermine everything, and it's safest when people are actually with community and around people. And we always tell people on harm reduction, like, don't use alone. But most people do die alone. That's the majority of overdose deaths. And so, yeah, I've kind of already said this, so I'll go to the next thing. So the discussion. So the community-based outreach supports provided to encampment residents during COVID-19 were highly beneficial for their survival and well-being. While residents valued those supports that met their greatest basic needs, such as tents and food, they also greatly appreciated the social relationships they developed with outreach workers and volunteers. And specific characteristics of outreach, so if you're doing outreach or you're in charge of people who do outreach, these are the kinds of things encampment residents were saying were important. That there was frequency, consistency, flexibility, and responsiveness to what residents were looking for, their input, were highlighted as what were critical and effective. Outreach groups and organizations also noted that the way they provided outreach was underpinned by key values. So that was about dignity, autonomy, reflexivity, reciprocity, and collaboration. And furthermore, the encampment environments became a space where residents were able to build communities in which they worked together to survive, which contrasted with more isolated experiences in shelter settings. Housing-specific outreach, typically by streets to homes of the city of Toronto, was less successful at meeting the needs of encampment residents, most of whom expressed an ongoing urgent need for permanent housing options rather than the traditional shelter and shelter hotel offers. Residents also highlighted a lack of transparency and accountability in their experiences with the city's outreach and shelter housing supports, often leading to distrust of these systems. Okay. Other findings illustrate that current shelter and housing supports are not sufficient to meet the needs of many people experiencing homelessness, and it's important to understand the extent to which the city's focus on clearing encampments harmed residents. Residents experienced much stress due to the constant threat of eviction and smaller scale eviction tactics throughout the pandemic, including receiving eviction notices sometimes without, people wouldn't know when they were going to be evicted, having their possessions removed. People talked about coming back and finding their tent and all their belongings were completely gone, or police were slashing people's tents. And being pressured to take indoor shelter offers, people felt the pressure to clear the park. They knew that eviction was coming, so they took a shelter offer that they didn't necessarily want. And people also talked about how they didn't have the adequate information to determine whether these options would actually meet their needs. Both residents and community-based outreach groups highlighted how the evictions efforts were destabilizing for residents, health and well-being, as well as disrupting outreach groups' attempts to support them and maintain community of care. I wish I had made some slides around safety, because it's interesting who gets to determine what is safe. You know, someone having a fire, a controlled fire, is safe when you're in freezing cold weather. It's like -20. You know, we had Khalil, who brought in tiny homes. He got sued by the city for giving people tiny shelters to live in through the winter. The city was not offering anything to people outside. More people would have died, and instead of celebrating someone for just taking that initiative, the city sued him. Like, it was crazy. It was a shame. It's so shameful. And when I think of people, like, I know, like, I think my coworker died, and then her partner was living in a TCHC unit, and because he was not on the lease, he was evicted, and he was sleeping in St. James Park under a tarp. And he died in that park. And he didn't need to be evicted from that unit. They could have figured out how to work with him until he found someplace. He lost his partner, he lost his pets, and he lost his life. And this is the thing, this is all about death. Like, we're talking about preventing death. We have a collective responsibility for that. So encampment evictions were also not effective at eliminating encampments and appear to continue the cycle of marginalization. I think we all know that. So many outreach workers and volunteers highlighted their need to engage in continual advocacy. You'll hear the city or other people who are on the city side talk about how advocates were always pushing this narrative and all the advocates are annoying, but it's like people who are on the street also doing outreach who didn't have they didn't have politicians to have to account for, and this, what? Yeah, you should be. Yeah, it's okay if you're annoying. You have to be, because it doesn't make any sense that here's this humanitarian crisis where we should be like providing everything we possibly can to people for a man-made problem, and instead we're punishing them until some of the people die, till 3 shelters worth of people die. Like there's no dignity in that. It is so inhumane, and it is so, it's just fucked up. So our findings reveal the ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic and the overdose crisis intersected with the housing crisis to complicate the residents' experiences. And a key lesson from our study centered around the importance of attending to encampment residents' perceptions of health and safety risks, which existed across all settings for people experiencing homelessness. Like, people love to talk about including people with lived experience, but people were not listening to encampment residents when they were saying, I don't want to be moved, I have nowhere to go to, if I go there, I will die, if I go there, I will be isolated. We were not listening to them. People were not being listened to. And so that's what our findings show, is that you have to center people, and it's not a tokenistic thing. You have to listen to what they're saying. And, because encampment residents reported losing many friends, family, and partners, as well as the experiences of finding people dead and witnessing people from encampments move into the shelter hotels. I even had to go off work for a bunch of months because someone was dead in the porta potty in Moss Park, and I watched them coming out of it, and I couldn't personally handle what I'd witnessed because I'd already bared so much witness to government abandonment that that was it for me. Outreach workers and volunteers also described the immense burden of bearing witness to traumatic events such as extreme deprivation, violence, and death, which were life-altering for some new volunteers. And they worried about the sustainability of outreach services. So just to be clear, outreach services have been cut in this city. As soon as the COVID has made this, like, we're making an about turn and everyone's going back inside, the funding dried up. And also, homeless services have had millions of dollars cut from them, including the loss of peer jobs, seniors programming, and those organizations aren't saying anything publicly, which is a problem. Okay. So the most critical implication of our findings is that encampments are going to continue to exist as an alternative to shelters as long as housing affordability continues to be a major problem in Toronto. And not just here, it's everywhere. It's all across the country. Like, I grew up in Whitehorse, Yukon. There's homelessness there. People are living in shelters. There's housing crisis all across the country. The pandemic has only made encampments more visible and highlighted pre-existing gaps in the housing support sector. And thus, increased investment in permanent housing must be urgently prioritized. And that's a variety of things, like, we have to do. And that's not making more, like, they made modular housing, it's like jail for people. Like, it's not emulating a living environment. We're talking about creating spaces for people where they feel like they belong and they have community and they want to live there. It's just not happening with the kind of housing that we're building. We're not really building housing. And I'm done, right? Okay. I told you, this is 83 pages with 40 recommendations. It's hard to cram in here. And I don't want to do a disservice. So yeah, shelter and housing services should be improved to better align with people's needs and encampment residents. And encampment residents know their needs best. So decision making must include them and be listened to. There was a table that was struck to listen to encampment residents. It never happened. It just fell apart. But, they'll have their homeless thing, their whatever table, their encampment table. It doesn't talk to all the people who are on the street doing stuff either. There were people that we interviewed who were doing outreach who had no idea that there was going to be a mass eviction that day. Like, it was even hard for us when we were doing data collection, because there was so much surveillance going on that we didn't want people to think we were surveilling them. Like, we weren't coming that way to them. And so we had to really connect with people who were in the encampments, people who were here, who helped us make sure we could connect to people. And we got, we got vouched for, because it was just so constant. It is so constant for people. So there's over 40 recommendations, and I honestly, the core value underlining these recommendations is that the provision of human life should be a collective responsibility. And, you know, sometimes what's legal or the law is actually not the law that should be governing us. We should be taking care of each other. We tried to sue the city, a group of us. I'm in the Toronto Overdose Prevention Society. We took the city to court to get rid of the camping bylaw. We lost, but we got an injunction. And that time, you know, we helped all summer people not be evicted, and that was a big deal. But, you know, but people being in public spaces, people are like, why do we do a land acknowledgement? Because the land is what keeps people, it helps people survive. It's what people go back to. That's what we're told. And yet we're saying you can't be in a public space. You can't use the land for your survival. You can't have a tent here. But people went there to survive, because if you are out on a freaking island and you have nothing, you are going to build a shelter. What did they do on Survivor? They built a shelter first. But we punished people for trying to survive, and we continue to do that because that is the approach that government has taken, and the bureaucracies that do it as well. They're not scot-free. So these are our next steps of our findings. You can find some stuff here. We have a full report, a brief report. We did a launch in Allen Gardens encampment last week to launch the report. We're doing an online launch, hopefully with other organizations. So if anyone's here who also been doing encampment outreach and you want to present together, I want people to know this is not, when someone is consulting with organizations, telling them what the plan is, they're adopting the same plans in every community, using enforcement, saying they don't, using it, hiring security. We've got $2 million in security contracts for security to be in public parks. We've got parks ambassadors with $9 million budgets just to police homeless people. They're not in the West End and Trinity Bellwoods where everyone drinks. They're in the East End harassing people. And then we have an article that's published in the Qualitative Research and Health Journal called "They Have Their Security, We Have Our Community," which is about mutual support among people experiencing homelessness. And thank you very much for coming to this presentation. I'm sorry I talk so fast.
Yeah, that was great energy and very relevant. And something that you touched on, which I think is really important, is the notion that the system isn't working. And in many ways, one of the things that I've contended for a number of years is that we've been trying to impose 19th century thinking on a 21st century challenge. Now, the interesting thing, you touched on the word financialization, and I can't let go of that when Emily just looked at me. Because you heard from the National Housing Advocate, and her office has just issued a referral to the National Housing Council, on which I sit, along with Emily. That referral has to do with looking at and asking us to conduct a review panel around the financialization of purpose-built rental housing. So that's going to be something that's going to unfold in 2023. And there's a tall guy with white hair who has been asked to chair that review panel. So I'm studying up, and I trust I'm going to hear from many of you and many of the people who want to advocate around that, because it's a mechanism that we have as a community of people who care to hold the government to account for the fact that we have the legislated right to housing, and we're not there yet. So thank you for that. Sue-Ann, do you want to stay where you are, or do you want to come here?
I think I'm going to stay here for now if this is
So
on. because
just,
I'm not
is
here
that
long
fine for the
enough.
microphone? Are you picking that up? Okay,
Is that
good.
okay over there? Okay, thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Zoe. That was like, you knocked it out of the park. That was an amazing talk. I loved it all. And so now we're gonna come back to our presentation here, coming to you from Quebec, from Montreal and Sherbrooke, Giojage, and I don't know the term for sure. Merci. And we've had technical issues today, so we're going to do a bit of a combo, English, French, a bit of translation, and then back to English, I think, is what we're gonna do. Zoe's a really hard act to follow, and it's like the last talk, so I'm exhausted. I'm really like overstimulated. But I think that there's a lot of lessons to share, actually, and a lot of similarities. I also have the advantage of having lived in Toronto a very long time ago, and I was definitely here as a young student outreach worker when we had the declaration declaring homelessness as a disaster, and I was here at that moment in time a very long time ago. 24 years ago, 23 years, anyway, a long time ago, I'm getting old. And I actually, when I come back to Toronto, and I don't come here very often, I am shocked at how much things have changed and worsened, and I find it very, very sad, and I find it hard. The talk you gave this morning, it's very, very troubling. So I appreciate the humanity with which you brought. Now I'm getting emotional. Anyway, and now I'm in Montreal, and I really had the great honor and privilege to do a kind of phase 1 project with co-researchers, an amazing team. I put a few names up there of everyone who's contributed to the project. And we will be having a launch on December 2nd. So today our presentation is going to be, well, at least my parts are just kind of setting the stage of what this project was. It's a little more academic, maybe a little less passionate than Zoe's, but I know Caroline is very passionate, so she's going to bring us back to that. It's good. It's all good. So today we're just going to present a few preliminary results at the end of the project, but we're going to do a special focus on Quebec because we thought it would be a nice complement with Zoe's and collective piece. And so this first project is a project exploring encampments across Canada in different regions and different locales to explore the human rights claims and violations of the right to housing related to homeless encampments. Acknowledging our dream team of co-researchers here and community advocates and people with lived experience that also contributed to the project as it enrolled. Not as ground up as we would have liked, but a phase 2 will be coming. And I also wanted to, Zoe did a great job of this, but just acknowledge, I don't really like the counter-narrative piece either, but I think it is a counter-narrative because I think what we hear about encampments is often shed in such a negative, a terrible light. So I just want to take a moment to say that we want to acknowledge that the dominant language of encampment does not reflect the depth of community and belonging experienced by those living outdoors together, nor does it reflect that tents are homes for many people, and encampments can also be considered communities or villages. This is also, especially as we found in BC, and I'm not the person that did the work in BC, but it's especially relevant with respect to Indigenous peoples who have distinct rights and relationships in relation to land and housing, and are disproportionately affected by these issues. So we just want to ask that the audience understand encampments as homes and that our use of the term encampment reflects that understanding. Next slide, please. I actually don't have any notes. So this is just a quick plan of the presentation we're going to do. I think I'm going to skip right to the 3rd slide, please. Thank you. This is very weird not to be in control of your own slides. And by the way, I didn't say I'm coming from University of Montreal. I am an academic, but I was an outreach worker in a former life for quite a long time. So, so the research context, it's really hard when I can't see the slide. I'm sorry. I think, oh, I've got it here. Oh, bless you. Thank you. Okay. So this first phase 1 project was really to provide relevant knowledge to examine the human rights dimensions of encampments across Canada. For the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, but it really is a bit of a strange research project because it grew out of basically an academic citizen mobilization movement that Caroline and I started related to the dismantlement of the encampment in Notre Dame in Montreal. And really Caroline was the leader on putting forward a petition declaring that people's rights were not being respected. And that we wanted kind of an immediate halt to the dismantlement that had occurred and was occurring. And like Zoe said, without much notice, actually, to people that were providing also outreach services and volunteers and encampments. So due to this kind of denial, we didn't get any response from a petition we started. We had lots of people jump in and say, yes, this is completely unfair. We didn't have any response from provincial government or municipal government. So we started reaching out to different academics and community advocates across the country that we had heard of, and we wanted to know how other people were living, basically, and responding to these evictions and dismantlements and the injustice they were living or witnessing. And from there, that was very kind of difficult to get off the ground, we were asked if we wanted to kind of mobilize some existing research we were already doing with different researchers in British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec to provide some of the context regarding the human rights dimensions, both as, the human rights violations that are taking place with evictions and dismantlements, but also the human rights claims to advance in response to violations of the right to housing. So I'm going to pass it over to Caroline.
All right. Okay, so I don't have the translation and I got my presentation in French. I'm gonna try to do it in English, so be patient with me. My name is Caroline Leblanc. I do my PhD at the Health Community Department at the Medicine Faculty. University of Sherbrooke, and I'm a member of LifeX also from Making the Shift, and I do a participatory research and ethnography by and for people who are on shelter. So my interest is more about the issues in the winter when you are on shelter. So now about this research, we did the spotlight, on Quebec on this presentation. And thank you, Zoe, for everything you say today. It was great. It was an honor to present with you. In Quebec, it's a lot of city, question themselves, about the answer we have about encampment and what is the best answer we can have. But they adopt a really oppression approach rather than based on the welfare. So the media scan was around 3 cities in Quebec, not much. We don't ignore, the other city, but that's, the city who was more, they have more spotlight in Quebec in the media. So we have Montreal, Gatineau, and Sherbrooke, and now we can have Granby also. So it's more what we're gonna talk about today. It's more the understanding, are the people, answer about encampment in Quebec. First, that was the first big encampment in Montreal, that was the first time we had a huge encampment. So that's why, we started this project, so we can understand also what's happened in other province and bring all the knowledge, to Quebec. That's it. So,
Can I say something?
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, because I jumped a slide and I feel really bad that I didn't provide more context. Can we go to slide number 4? Sorry about that. It's because I can't see the screen. So just to say, and that's totally my fault. I'm really sorry, Caroline, that I'm jumping in here. Number 4, the scope of work one? The one before that one. Yeah. Thank you. So in order to give some general orientating guidelines to the human rights claims, we broke the scope of work down into 4 kind of distinct deliverables, I guess I would say. And today, so we're going to have a big launch on December 2nd where this will be a little more clear. But I just wanted to highlight that I think the richest part of what we did, so these were the 4 components that we produced, were really a limited number of case studies to showcase local responses. So for instance, in BC, Prince George, and Crab Park in Vancouver, and these case studies will be going live when everything goes live, and they really are extremely rich, and the different co-researchers often with community advocates, often with people with lived experience in the encampments that help contribute to these case studies as well, to ground them in, well, much to what Caroline is going to explain, and also what Zoe was talking about community and solidarity and the difficulties and the struggles. So I just wanted to highlight that these case studies will be available soon, and I think they provide a really rich understanding. And when we started reaching out across the country to find out how, dismantling and evictions were happening, because it was we say new in Quebec, but it's not really, informal settlements have always existed, but in the way that there was this kind of bigger encampment and, downtown Montreal, Campement Notre-Dame, there was a real spotlight, and we started talking to people out west, and they started talking about exactly the fire risks and things like that, and how soft powers come in and invoke fire hazards as a serious problem. So we have to evict everyone because there's a fire risk. Well, we started to make connections with what we were seeing in Quebec because other municipalities have had the experience of encampments in tent cities longer than we have. So it was also a learning, I guess, situation. So just sorry about that. I didn't highlight that these were the 4.
Thank you.
I'm very, very sorry. I'm really, anyway, it's back to you.
So we're gonna talk about the community answer about encampment in Quebec. We're gonna talk also about the politic answer they have about encampment, and the academic. You already say something about that. So the first thing I want to say, it's the answer about people who are living in the encampment. It's really important to consider them voice, because they live in a encampment. And on the media scan, was a lot of people who was talking, so we kind of understand a lot of things, like from them voice. So that was really interesting. The people resist, they don't want to go in the shelter, and that's part of my research, but I don't presenting that today, but they really resist to go in the shelter, or they just don't have access. We have to think about that. Why they resist, to go in the shelter, because they get control. They feel like livestock. Also, they get judged. They are it's so many reasons. And also they want to rent logement, like
Rent?
a rent, but without intervention, without
supports, without interventions.
Exactly, because when you go on this kind of project, to have a rent, it's always, you need to see social work and stuff like that. But a lot of people doesn't want to go on this kind of program because they don't want to get support, or they don't feel like that. And the other thing is they believe also they can face the issues of security if they are prepared, So if, example, in the encampment after the first big one, they had incendie, les instincts.
Fires?
Yeah,
fire extinguishers?
Yeah. So they put that everywhere. Every tent had one. So, they answer, by themselves, just to protect, and answer to the political also answer. So that was one thing, they believe. And the other thing, they self-manage also the donation. They did a website, just to make sure, the people, the citizens who come and support them, they have the good donation, just to answer them needs. Also, you want to help me? Maybe you can. Yeah, no, it's okay. It's pretty hard to present. Ouais, je peux-tu? Ah ouais, là, je vais être comme Zoé, man.
Zoe number 2.
Number 2. How many people speak French here?
Hey, cool, okay.
Okay. Sorry for the rest. I'm gonna do it in French.
Hold on.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Bah, ils pensent vraiment aussi que les démantèlements, ça va venir augmenter les risques. Zoé en a parlé beaucoup, mais il y a une grosse perte de repères. Il y a aussi une rupture avec les liens de la communauté qui va faire en sorte que cette communauté-là est vraiment une grande force dans leur vie. Moi, je parle toujours de survie entre parenthèses parce que ces gens-là sont en vie, tout d'abord, et en survie à un certain moment. Donc, la communauté vient les supporter beaucoup. Quand ils sont démontés, démanteler aussi. Il y a toute une perte de repères qui les met davantage à risque, entre autres pour les surdoses, mais aussi que ça soit au niveau de la santé au niveau des crises de cœur, des choses comme ça, ils vont être isolés et donc il n'y aura pas le soutien de la communauté pour leur venir en aide. Il y a toute la perte des effets personnels, faut pas négliger ça, mais c'est vraiment un enjeu majeur parce que ces gens-là ont peu de choses, mais les choses qu'ils ont sont vraiment précieuses et nécessaires. Et donc, les démantèlements vont amener aussi une certaine précarité et va réduire leur capacité. Fait que, ce que j'ai trouvé intéressant, c'est que quand il y a eu des démantèlements, c'est que les personnes en situation d'itinérance se sont mobilisées pour aller manifester aussi devant l'hôtel de ville à Montréal, ce qui on a rarement vu parce que les personnes en situation d'itinérance sont souvent invisibilisées. Et il y a une personne qui dit justement pour combattre l'itinérance, il faut être davantage visible et de plus en plus, tu vois les personnes en situation d'itinérance se mobiliser pour aller manifester et revendiquer leurs droits. Fait que c'est quand même un tournant assez intéressant au Québec. Faut aussi voir de l'autre côté toute la communauté, les résidents qui cohabitent avec les campements. Bien, il y a une vague de solidarité. À l'inverse, c'est sûr qu'il y en a qui vont protester la présence des personnes qui vivent dans les campements, mais il faut aussi souligner les bons coups que la communauté fait et eux aussi, ils vont revendiquer le droit à l'occupation parce qu'il y a eu une super belle chimie, on pourrait dire, une belle cohabitation entre les gros campements et le quartier. Donc, c'était vraiment intéressant à voir. Et la réponse communautaire, il y a eu un regroupement qui s'appelle « On ne laisse personne derrière ». C'est un regroupement qui réunit 18 organismes en itinérance, puis des regroupements sectoriels aussi. Pour eux, en fait, c'est que les refuges créent de l'exclusion et donc, ils tenaient vraiment à ce que revendiquer en fait que les ressources devaient être différentes et on devait innover de plus en plus pour être inclusif parce qu'actuellement, le système de refuge ne répond pas aux besoins des personnes qui habitent les campements. Ils demandent de renoncer au démantèlement étant donné que ça met à risque la santé des personnes qui les habitent. Mais il y a aussi qu'ils soulignent que les campements, ça ne remplace pas les logements parce qu'on sait qu'il y a une approche qui est vraiment prédominante dans l'itinérance, qui est le logement d'abord. Par contre, on doit dire que ça ne remplace pas un logement, mais c'est une forme, un type de logement qui assure une certaine stabilité et une solution vers lesquelles les personnes qui habitent la rue, en fait, vont se tourner. On doit respecter aussi leur choix de se poser quelque part et de les soutenir à travers tout ça. Donc, il y a eu beaucoup de campagnes de dons. Il y a eu aussi des dépliants informatifs pour soutenir les personnes qui habitent les campements. Et ils vont réclamer aussi, ce regroupement-là va réclamer aussi la gestion des déchets, l'aide alimentaire dans les campements et l'installation sanitaire. Et je tiens à préciser que ce n'est pas des tentes qu'on démantèle, mais bien des humains qui habitent ces tentes-là. Et c'est ça, dans ma recherche, c'est aussi des gens qui vont habiter sur un banc de parc. Donc, pour moi, c'est aussi considéré comme un campement parce que c'est un lieu, un habitat. Alors, voilà, je fais un petit breed avec ma recherche. La réponse politique, maintenant, on peut changer, on est rendu...
Can we go to the next slide?
The other one, too. The other one, yeah. Yeah, this one. Qu'est-ce qui est super intéressant, c'est qu'au niveau de la réponse politique, il y a vraiment une distorsion entre la réalité du terrain qui se passe dans les campements, mais aussi l'instabilité des décisions. Il reste 5 minutes, hein? C'est pas grave, je vais faire ça vite. Donc, c'est un point hyper important à comprendre, c'est toute l'instabilité dans les positions parce que je pense qu'on n'a pas la réponse à comment on peut réellement interagir avec les campements. Puis je pense qu'il y a comme beaucoup de négociations politiques autour des campements. Donc, par exemple, il y a une opposition qui va demander le moratoire, puis de l'autre côté, ils vont demander, ils vont pas tolérer du tout les campements. Donc, il y a quand même un grand enjeu politique là, à travers tout ça qu'il faut quand même considérer. Ils vont prendre une approche communautaire au tout début, hein, avec la collaboration, tout ça, puis vite fait, ils vont quand même pencher vers une approche punitive, malheureusement, parce que ils ont un manque de solutions et ils sont quand même déterminés à voir les campements disparaître de la ville. Donc, ça fait en sorte que l'approche punitive va être vraiment favorisée rapidement plutôt qu'une approche communautaire. Un peu comme dans le reste du Canada, ils vont interagir aussi en invoquant qu'il y a des problèmes importants face à la nuisance aux citoyens, aussi les enjeux de santé, de sécurité, l'insalubrité. Et donc, ça va les amener vraiment à vouloir s'assurer que les campements ne prennent pas forme. Il y a une certaine tolérance à un certain moment, mais vite, ça plonge la personne dans une instabilité d'être toujours sous la menace, d'être toujours... Il ne sait jamais s'il va être démantelé ou s'il va arriver un matin puis que finalement, il va se faire démanteler. Puis c'est souvent aux petites heures du matin où les gens sont les plus vulnérables que les démantèlements se passent, malheureusement. Et souvent, les organismes communautaires ne sont pas présents pour différentes raisons. Et donc, ça va engendrer des risques quand même assez importants. Il y a une distorsion aussi entre la perception des conséquences du démantèlement. Plusieurs décideurs vont dire que ça s'est déroulé dans le calme, mais à l'inverse, quand on parle avec les personnes du terrain, c'est des moments très traumatisants, c'est des moments très difficiles. Donc, il y a quand même quelque chose à aller équilibrer entre les deux perceptions parce que ça peut être vraiment... ça peut venir réduire un peu les conséquences quand on pense à ça. Et donc, maintenant, Tolérance Zéro à Montréal, ils ont engagé aussi un coordinateur, une personne pour coordonner les démantèlements. Et donc, on est rendu là à Montréal, là, malheureusement, c'est vraiment une tolérance zéro. Donc, les gens qui vivent en campement vont vivre davantage d'oppression de la part des visiteurs. Et donc, l'inaction des gouvernements provinciaux et fédéraux qui ressortait beaucoup dans le médiascan qu'on a fait, tant le municipal demandait au gouvernement des différents paliers à agir que le communautaire. Donc, ça, c'est vraiment très, très, très prédominant là, au niveau de la réponse envers les campements. Alors, comme conclusion, je dis qu'on doit opter pour une approche qui est axée sur les droits et le bien-être plutôt que sur la répression qui peut avoir des conséquences très, très graves sur la santé. Voilà. C'est un peu mieux, là, hein?
Yeah, can I say one thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, because I think maybe I don't know if this is on, maybe it hasn't been touched on the same way, because we both had a conclusion, but it's good. No, it's good. Just to go back to the slide before, please. I just wanted to say in our project, we attempted to kind of mobilize the National Protocol on Homeless Encampments put out by the Shift, and these are the principles. So the things like self-determination, dignity, integrity, yeah, all those elements there, I wanted to mention that. And I wanted to mention that one of the things we found in the project, and this is really the contribution of co-researchers who are, you know, legal scholars and have been studying vagrancy laws for a long time, just the increase, the rise in the last 10 years, and this is not just a big Toronto city phenomenon or a big Montreal phenomenon. This has been found in towns and small cities and small towns, that there's been like, I think a 50% or plus increase of the enactment of bylaws that specifically target, that are anti-homelessness bylaws, neo-vagrancy, that target panhandling, loitering, obstructing, salvaging, resting, sleeping, sheltering, and disorder. And so anything like, you know, bathing, using the toilet in public, which, you know, if you're occupying public space, that's what you got to do because you have to exist somewhere in order to exist. So just to say that in our report that's going to come out, there's a really great section on the impact of municipal bylaws. And these are recommendations that we're making that, you know, everybody has to get involved. Like, obviously, you know, our recommendations are pitched to the Federal Housing Advocate, but I also come back to what Zoe said, and I feel the same thing, that, you know, if people are experiencing homelessness and it's not what they want to be experiencing, if that's, not what they're choosing to experience living outside, we as a society have a collective responsibility to do something about it. And as much as we want governments to do things, I think as a society we have to really understand that, people are citizens and have rights, and we need to just collectivize the issue more than perhaps even what we're going to be able to do in this report. So, and just last slide, please, just to welcome you all. December 2nd, we're going to have a launch. We're trying to get there. There's going to be a webinar and to share some of what we found with all of you. So I just wanted to say that. Thanks very much.
So, having listened, this is your chance. And unfortunately, rather than allowing you to sit in the comfort of where you are, in order for those who are following us online to be able to hear your question, you're actually going to have to come and stand. Actually, I probably recommend that they stand right here, eh, Adam?
Can you repeat the question in
Yeah.
the mic?
Or I could repeat it, yes.
Yeah, I think we should just
I might be
repeat it.
capable of doing that. I don't know if
That's
I'll
a good
understand
idea.
all the
I'd be
questions,
too
but
shy, like if I
Yeah.
had to come up with
Yeah, I'd be
one,
shy too.
que ça soit en anglais ou en français.
Maybe they are
But
maybe not very.
so if you have a question, at least make it short, because I'm old and my memory doesn't work all that well anymore. So go ahead.
Oh, am I the first one?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for all the work you do and for an excellent, passionate presentation. Thank you so much, everybody. What I loved about this presentation, if I could just,
If you're going to talk, you got to come up here.
Get involved, get involved. Collective responsibility in action,
Because
right?
if it's a question, I can repeat it. If it's a speech, forget it.
exactly, right? So,
If you're gonna rail against me though, like you can go out there.
but what I really enjoyed is that, the findings that you're pointing out have to do with collective responsibility. And the idea that what we're really dealing with here is the financialization and the commodification of housing at the root cause. And, over 20 years ago when the crisis was first announced, at that time we all thought something's going to get done about this. And then it got worse and worse and worse. Every single year, more and more people are dying, more and more, it's a catastrophe. It's an absolute catastrophe. But I really think that what these are saying, these research findings are saying, is that we have to be more into the advocacy roles in our work. Not just we have to really push and really point out the elephant in the room, which is public housing, rent caps, rent rollbacks, no evictions, make them illegal, all of those things that are really just basic. So that said, I also want to say that given the research findings that were just presented today, there's a National Day of Action on Housing on November 22nd. And I know that in my job, we are actually taking folks in the community. Some people live in encampments, some people live in the rooming houses, and we're doing posters and we're talking about why a home is important, and we're bringing it to the action. But I just wanted to also plug that. All right. Thank you so much, everybody.
I just want to
There's
make
a-
one comment.
Okay, just a comment from Zoe, and then your question. You come
want to
on,
make
come on
a
up here,
comment
lawyer.
about one of the. So I'm gonna take my mask off. I'm like putting my mask on and off, but like I am really wearing a mask here. This is my first time being at a conference, so I haven't had COVID yet. So, no, I'm just joking. I just wanted to say, when we talked to workers and volunteers, a lot of them talked about not being able to talk publicly about what was happening, that they were worried about losing their jobs, that they couldn't actually speak up about the human rights abuses that they were witnessing, that really weighed heavy on them. And one of our recommendations is that workers and workers specifically should be allowed to be able to say what's happening without repercussion, that they shouldn't be silenced in their workplaces, and they shouldn't be silenced from being public about it. Because it was really difficult for us to interview city workers, for instance. Like, we tried our best to talk to the city workers. We tried so hard to have city workers speak with us, and we were only able to talk to one city worker from Streets to Homes, which is, unfortunate for our findings. We would have liked to have talked to more, and that is a problem. Like, people should be able to say what they're thinking, what their experiences as well, and that made it difficult. Our research did go through ethics. It did have city people at the table. It's not like people weren't there, and the bosses said they were going to help us. So that is one area. Like, I think it would be interesting to hear what they actually have to say, and also but I don't know if they would even say different from what the policies of their organization state.
You know, everyone today has mentioned how different it is talking to a crowd of people. It really is. I haven't done this in person yet. With the Pan-Canadian study, I noticed that you had Toronto and Hamilton, that you had Prince George and Vancouver. And it may be too late to suggest this as another sort of case study, but Halifax was also going through some of the same things. I don't know if you guys already looked at doing Halifax, but it seemed like it was very similar in sort of scope as it was happening, at least. I don't know if I'll give you guys a moment to.
But we tried to get in touch with people there in Halifax too, and they didn't work out, you know.
Okay.
But you know, we tried really
Did we
hard.
try Halifax?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't remember. No, I've been following the news like from a distance, and I'm from the Maritimes originally, so it interests me too. What's happening in Halifax? But the project was already underway. But there's a phase 2 happening that's going to be more ground up, I think, and I'm less involved in phase 2, but Kathleen's more involved in phase 2.
Okay.
So you can speak to it a lot better.
I don't have so much information yet, so I just don't want to.
But we,
No, that's
but
fine.
we take,
But-
thank you for the suggestion, though.
But thank you for the suggestion.
Of course.
Yeah, appreciate that.
Other questions?
Halifax, that is us.
Question or comment? You want to come up here? Yeah.
I love this. You have to come to the podium.
Yeah. Come to the podium.
Ta-da!
You're like, hey. What I keep noticing, and even in the other session, which I had a lot of disagreement with what was being said in Ian de Jong's session, there's this disconnect between human rights law and the bylaws. And it should be clear from a legal perspective that the charter should override the bylaws. And yet we are constantly going through these kinds of push-pull between which one takes precedence. And in the last session, I saw that apparently neither does, that they coexist, and yet they clearly do not. You can't evict people when it's problematic in terms of human rights. So, you know, you're going to come out with recommendations around bylaws. And I'm wondering, how can we push this even further to say that these are nullified even? I don't know if it's a charter challenge. You'd have to do that provincially.
Exactly, and I'm not a.
You're not a
legal
lawyer,
scholar, no,
yeah.
but there are people on the team that are and are looking at what to do with it. I wouldn't say we're going to make recommendations about municipal bylaws. We're going to say this is what's happening with bylaws.
Okay.
This is the impact on people. The anti-homelessness, neo-vagrancy laws, they affect people that are like the most marginalized, the most discriminated against, that, you know, suffer from the most stigma. And this does not work. This is not right. And why is there such an explosion and increase? But it's directly related to the financialization, commodification of housing, because, you know, is public space really public anymore, right? Like,
Yeah.
who's it public for? Who's allowed to be in public space?
Yeah.
So it's not that we're making recommendations about the bylaws, it's that we're, like, Joe Hermer's the one that carried that piece of the research, because he's studied neo-vagrancy law for a long time, and so he has, you know, big project looking at it across Canada to pinpoint what are the neo-vagrancy laws that are in effect, and look how much they've increased over time, even in small towns. This isn't just a big city phenomenon. And then so this is problematic, and this is problematic because people can't basically claim and exercise their human rights. So what can the federal government do about it? Perhaps what provincial governments can do about it. That's a little trickier, as we know, with provincial governments. But it's basically to say, hey, it's a collective responsibility. Like, what are we going to do about this? Are we going to let municipalities just basically, you know, penalize people all the time? Is that really, you know?
As an affront to our superseding laws, as a point of fact. So yeah, okay, like it's just something I'm
So-
constantly
Yeah.
thinking about, and just noticing again, like it's just always this push-pull between the two when there is a hierarchy, and yet we act like that's not the case.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
That's why I have such an issue when people say we should engage with business associations and residents associations. Like, here in Toronto, resident associations or homeowners and business associations, like the BIA has its own agenda and have been really anti-homeless and also hire their own security and have their own outreach and get funding from the city to do that, like the Downtown Young BIA, and it's extremely problematic. Because it's saying who can be in public space and who cannot be in public space, and maybe other people have different views on that, but I think it's quite disgusting that there are people with that much privilege being able to talk about what people who are struggling in poverty get to experience, or how things get to be, or what those interventions are. It's the same with like safe injection sites. Like, I don't care if you're fucking opposed to them, because you're not going to use them. They're not for you. You don't get a say in them. It's the same with public housing. If you're not going to live there, I don't care what your opinion is about it. And we give those people too much power to say they don't want something, and that's a huge problem with our system here. They do consultations all the time, and it's like, if people are poor bashing, you're just actually just giving them a venue as a hate rally. And you have policies within the city that say that you know, anti-discrimination policies, and yet you host meetings that are so discriminatory. And I don't care if that neighbor hates it. I don't care, because it shouldn't be allowed that they get that much power and voice. So when I see like a suggestion that you should, you know, have these people at your table and these, no, who are the most important people? The most important people are the ones feeling the brunt of the system and struggling in poverty.
Yeah.
Yeah, it pisses me off so much.
I mean, it's feeds into what you're saying. So
Yeah,
you have
exactly.
coercive approaches as well, right?
Yeah, because they demand to be, they demand that these laws are upheld,
Yeah.
right?
We had a question over here.
Yeah, just from Saskatchewan, and in the West, we have provincial governments that are implementing simplistic policies like the Saskatchewan First Act, which what is that? But it's like meant to, in Alberta, they have the same thing where they're talking about having control over basically every aspect of government life. My worry about when I see these types of reports is that it's gonna be leveraged by the right to galvanize their base, and so that they can give. I think we're saying these are what's happening, this is what should happen, but when you come at it from the flip side, it also provides a blueprint for folks that are opposed to homeless encampments on how to enact bylaws. And it's really easy to get elected municipally if you're against homeless encampments. You make that your whole campaign, and then all of a sudden you're one of the most powerful people at City Hall. And so I guess my question is, how do you counteract when our own documents, I've seen this with safe consumption sites, we design reports and stuff for good, but then you see it in Vancouver, where they're now starting to, you know, and especially in Alberta, they're starting to leverage the guidelines that we've established to get a successful safe consumption site, and then create processes and bylaws that make it so we actually can't get them in place anymore. So how do you navigate that?
Okay, let me summarize just for the people watching online. The question is, and it's very pertinent, often a report like this can become fodder for those who want to take aim at the very thing that we as a community of practitioners and people who care and activists are trying to resolve. And so you quite correctly point out that a report like this can become a great big bullseye for, dare I say, populist politicians at every level to say, aha, gotcha. And so how do you deal with that?
I mean, they're smart. They're always coming out in front. It's the same with like decriminalization, where the police are at the tables, like making that plan. Like they're clever in that way. I'll give them that. You know, for us here in Toronto, you would think like we had progressive councillors. I'm putting that in quotes because it was really upsetting how there were people who like said that they were progressive, and we couldn't even get them to come out to see an encampment. We were like, this is in your ward, Joe Cressy. Like, yes, thank you for helping us with safe injection sites, but why will you not come and see what's happening in your ward? And that was the same with Mike Layton. It was the same with Kristen Wong Tam. It was the same with all these ones who claim to be progressive, that they would not come and see. Like, so not only do we have a problem with the right using our reports, but we have the problem with the so-called progressives not even wanting to acknowledge what's happening, and then also feeding into the kind of populist mindset of we have to get people out of public spaces. I think this report is really for us too. Like, these reports are also for us to think about, are we feeding into a neoliberal agenda, or are we actually doing good work? What is our reflection on ourselves, and how do we engage? Because, you know, organizations will then engage with right-wing politicians using reports like this, thinking they're doing a good thing, but they actually are just like feeding that person's agenda. So I don't know. I think it's something we have to just be on top of. Like, it was really sad to see the mayor election in Vancouver, and just the demand for 100 more police and 100 mental health nurses, and blaming people in poverty like that's something new, people on the streets. Like, it is important for us to like kind of speak to the bigger issue, which is like, well, this homelessness has been like this since da-da-da-da-da, like it's not new. But the creating of a villain and an enemy, and it's always been part of this society in the ways so that those who have the most power can utilize it. So I don't know. That's my answer for you, Jason Mercady. But you're so smart, you probably have an answer.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think as long as somehow we can create an us and a them,
Yeah, exactly.
that there's going to be a problem. Because one of the things that I think the pandemic tried to teach us, if there was anything good that came out of it, is there's no such thing as us and them. There's only us. Us, right?
Yeah, but we felt us in them. Like, I felt us in them as soon as the pandemic hit, and we went out and people were abandoned to die. Like, if volunteer organizations like the Encampment Support Network and the Indigenous Harm Reduction Network hadn't started, we wouldn't have had enough people to bring humanitarian aid to people on the streets. And the city itself was okay with abandoning people to die. It's always us and them. And I think that's the place we have to start, is that there is an us and them. And what is our role in making sure we are a more collective group of people? Because it as we've seen through the pandemic, and then after the pandemic, and we're still in the pandemic, and now we're in this other phase, it's even worse. Things are even worse. So many people died. So many things are closing. They don't care. And I think that's the point, is that we're trying to fight against a system and look for band-aids to a gaping wound, which is a much bigger issue. If we don't start talking about how capitalism is fucking us over, and like, you don't need to get a report, you can just look it on View It CA and try to find an apartment, and then try to find one without any credit. Being a renter in the city sucks. You can get evicted so easily. You know, you just have to look at the court docket to see. I've been evicted. I had to go to court for 10 years with the landlord. So it's like, we have no rights as tenants, and if we rent, we're renting for someone else's investment. We're paying rent to them that they're gonna have the investment. Like, it's fucked up. And so that is the place we need to start, is like honest truth about where we're at. This homeless sector shouldn't even exist, and everyone should be working their way out of a job. Like, that's the weirdest thing about being at this conference, I gotta say. Weird.
Yes, I think Tim said it today, is that we're looking to put ourselves out of work, and as quickly as possible. There's a question at the back, and then there's one over here, and then we may have to wrap it up depending on how it goes. So,
I'm just gonna try and get loud.
okay,
Not loud, I'm gonna
but I still have to repeat your question.
I'll keep it short. Zoe, where are we gonna be next year at this conference, if we're gonna have one? All the education workers are gonna end up homeless. I mean, I'm exaggerating. Education, health workers, transportation, all of these people will lose eventually if we continue on the trajectory you just described. So the majority will then be the homeless population, if you take it to the extreme. So what does that do to us? Do we sit back and say, well, that's the other guy? What are we sitting here for? Why can't we mobilize here at this conference?
Okay, so I'm just going to repeat the short version of your question is, what's going to happen next year if there's so many people who fall into homelessness as a function of the variety of things that are happening, and why don't we just mobilize here? So,
Just put an addendum to that. Jill Andrews got kicked out of Parliament today. Most.
Oh. So, how do you answer that question?
How do I answer? Don't be a politician. I'm just kidding. I also have been kicked out of there, so, and I'm not a politician. But you know, if you stand in there, it's so steep that they don't drag you out because they're scared you'll tumble over. So just a hint. I think we have to be real about the situation that we're living in right now. Like, it is terrible outcomes for young people. Like, the future does not look bright at all. And that's what I'm looking to. I'm hoping to follow just what, like, I'm in my 40s. So, like, I'm hoping to follow younger people's leadership, because that, to me, is the answer. And also, we live on stolen land. And so that's the same. I'm just like, if I believe in decolonization, then I'm also looking to Indigenous people. Like, I will do whatever, follow behind, so tell me to go away. But this is the reality, is like, we have to really shift, because we cannot continue the way that we're going forward. I mean, it also starts with people being openly talking. Like, it really upsets me that people work in shelters and see the conditions of what people are living in and don't say anything.
Or you try to say something and then you're like, oh, that's not our problem.
Exactly.
Well, it kind of is, and I can't
It is.
morally
It
accept
is.
Yeah.
that because this is not my value.
Yeah, and we can't leave it to certain individuals, like, who are the most vocal all the time. Like, it's exhausting to them too. So you really have to step up too. Like, if there's so much injustice, and I'm not going to be prescriptive about anything. I think we're here because we care about issues related to homelessness, and we do have a collective struggle in that. Whether we agree about how we do it or come to terms, I don't know. Like, I don't know if we would all agree at this conference either.
Yeah, I don't think we would, and I think
Yeah.
that one of the things, coming back to your point, like, it does feel like we're gonna hit a wall. It feels like we've already hit a wall. It feels like we've hit many walls.
Yeah.
But I think some of this work we're involved in Quebec is around prevention. And it's actually so nice I know it seems crazy because we're in a crisis moment, but it's actually so nice, and it's like action research with youth with lived experience. It's like, it's kind of mind-blowing to change the conversation. And to say, and actually, if the starting point is prevention, then it becomes collective. Because if we know that prevention work has to be like broad-based and all the sectors, and the sectors, like, not necessarily, like, before the homelessness sector, like, all the different sectors that are involved, and the societies, and the people around the person, and, like, it just changes the whole tone of the conversation and the ways that you, to action. And I think for youth too, like, I mean, I've got 4 kids, I've got 4 teenagers, and I hear the conversation around, and also in the work I do around the prevention work, and a lot of people are saying, it's the generation of the no future youth.
Yeah.
And it really breaks my heart. Like, it makes me really emotional, because it's like, what kind of future are we giving youth? And is a youth, life course just attached to the labor market and the market economy? No, like, people are bigger than that. People are bigger than the money they make. Like, that's not what life is about. Like, we have to give youth also other opportunities and other ways of imagining futures and stuff. So I don't know, for me, the prevention work lately has been it's just taken me, after 20 years of working on this stuff, it's just taken me in it's changed the conversation in a way that is so much more interesting. And I don't know if we're going to be able to do, what we're going to be able to do, because I know we're in a crisis moment too, so I'm not trying to be naive, but I'm just saying it's nice to have a different starting point, a different way of looking at things,
I will
actually.
say, it was like, one thing that was kind of exciting was, like, when people didn't have jobs, people could organize. So people were organizing, people were helping,
Right.
people were going to help their neighbors, they were organizing because they weren't working, so they were on CERB. And there were a lot of musicians and artists in this city who were, like, helping and who wanted to do something. And then people started working together, and then, like, those of us in the sector, we were, like, training people, because we're like, okay, well, people need some guidance. You can't just go in an encampment. Like, we should just talk to each other. And so that was also happening. So there was, like, a lot of this kind of collective back and forth. And then the government wanted people to get back to work. I think, like, was really motivated to get people back to work even faster, because people were spending that time saying, we have to be in this together. And so I think that's just something we have to reflect on, is, like, as soon as people went back to work, we didn't have the same kind of collective groups of people out there helping anymore, because then we have to, like, pay our rent that's 3/4 of our income, and and trying to survive too.
Yes.
There might be questions in Q&A. I can't see it because I'm not the moderator.
Yeah.
Do you have your app open?
Let me open it, but first let me get to your question because you've been patient at the back.
Yeah, just first of all, thanks, Tony, thanks, thanks, Brendan. I wanted to ask a question that's a little bit legalistic and it's related to my presentation on Friday. I'm going to go just very quickly.
Come on up here.
Okay.
Why don't you come up here?
The question is, why frame this issue as right to housing as opposed to right to shelter? Because the courts, and I know you guys are not seeing this from the judge's perspective, of course not. The courts always talk about the right to shelter. Is that why you guys chose right to housing?
Right to housing is better.
Okay,
Right to
so
housing
the
is better.
question just is why the right to housing as opposed to the right to shelter?
I'm just gonna not answer that question if that's okay, but I think housing is so much different than just shelter. I mean, housing is home, housing is, like, there's so many identity pieces and citizenship pieces that shelter doesn't necessarily capture in the same way, but yeah, it's also the way we mobilize, because we also partnered up with the Shift on the right to housing, so for sure that's like our starting point too, for like the lens, the principles at the end, that's kind of the, like the lens we had going forward in the project, but I think that shelter can be very reductionistic in terms of, it's not, so, yeah, I much prefer the bigger, broader feeling.
I don't even know if a rights-based approach is even the
Exactly.
thing to use either, you know, like,
It's symmetric.
exactly, yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's really what it's come to, right? It's like an individual responsibility, but it's not.
No, and I guess this is the point in time when I think we should thank our presenters.
Thank you, guys.
Merci infiniment, merci tout le monde, merci pour votre participation et à demain.
Je pensais que tu allais avoir le temps de dire quelque chose d'autre.